Hey guys, so you got to start with a joke, right? In public speaking school, they always tell you have to start with a joke or everybody's going to go to sleep. So we'll start with one. What did socialists use for lighting before candles? Because they're thinking, put your thinking caps on. Well, they used electricity and light bulbs, of course, right? What do you think they used? Right? And the people of Venezuela can tell you all about it, right? I mean, they're experiencing that right now. And honestly, the subject today is really unfunny, so it's important that we start with a joke. So, socialism, right? This is the reality today. This just came out today. They did a poll. YouGov did this poll. They said 70% of millennials would vote for a socialist candidate. So let that sink in, folks. And I'm a millennial. I'm terribly embarrassed to admit it. You tell people you're a millennial, they're like, oh, so you're an idiot. Okay, good. We're not all idiots. But this is serious, right, guys? I mean, we're not going to be here eventually, and these millennials are going to be the ones calling the shots. How did we get to this point in our history? We got 36% of millennials think communism is good. Right? We just heard about how they massacred 100 million people just in the last 100 years. How in the world is this possible? You've got millions of young Americans today running around supporting AOC. They think the world's doomed in 12 years unless we ban cow flatulence and airplanes. How could this have possibly happened? It's really very bizarre, right? I've got a 3-year-old at home, and he's got a little kangaroo, and you take his kangaroo, and I've done this experiment. He says, give me that, that's mine. How did he know it was his? Because he believes in private property. So obviously, little kids understand private property, right? How did we get to this situation where the great majority of our young people want to abolish our private property system, our freedom? Well, I'm going to show you tonight. Here's some more polling data. Only 50% of young Americans say they're even sure God exists anymore. Right? And this is another thing. Little kids in every country in the world, every culture, doesn't matter if their parents are Hindu or Buddhist or atheist, little kids, and they've done studies on this, have an innate understanding about the fact that God exists. They were created by God for a reason. So you don't have to indoctrinate them, and until they're exposed to something else, they understand this. They can't quote scripture for you, that's true, but they do have an understanding of the fact that God created them. So this is some very, very troubling data. You've got 3/4 of young people today think the government ought to control their health care. 67% want the government to pay for their college. More than half would rather live in a socialist country. Almost half want to abolish our border agency. And then we get to socialism, right? Speaking of socialism, you guys see this guy here, Adolf Hitler. They don't teach the kids anymore, but the guy was a socialist. In fact, he was the leader of the National Socialist Party. Right? They won't tell you that in public school. He was a socialist in every sense of the term. And he was wrong about pretty much everything, but he was right about one thing. And this is one of those real quotes. You know, there's so many fake quotes out there. This is a real one. This came up in the Nuremberg trials. It said, he alone who owns the youth gains the future. And that's a really profound statement. You know, we all think of Hitler's war machine and how he invaded Poland and all this. Well, that was one part of his strategy, but the real central core of his strategy was brainwashing the youth. He was actually the first government on earth to make it a crime to educate your own children. He banned homeschooling. Why would he do that? Because he knew that if you want to build a 1,000-year Reich of socialism, you have to brainwash the kids. And so I want to show you what's happening in America today, right? They're telling us this to our face. This is Melissa Harris Perry on MSLSD talking about who owns the children.
Your kid is yours and totally your responsibility. We haven't had a very collective notion of these are our children. So part of it is we have to break through our kind of private idea that kids belong to their parents or kids belong to their families and recognize that kids belong to whole communities. Once it's everybody's responsibility and not just the households, then we start making better investments.
Yeah, collective child rearing, right? It worked so well in the Soviet Union with agriculture that, hey, let's try that with our kids, right? That's crazy talk, but that's what they're telling us today on national television, on a supposedly mainstream station. It's actually U.S. policy, believe it or not. In the final years of the Obama administration, they got the Department of Education and the Department of Health and Human Services. They put out this policy document. You can still read it on the government's website. They say parents get to be equal partners with the government in raising their own children. Isn't that nice? We get to be equal partners. But there's conditions. We need home visitation, right? We need bureaucrats to come check that we're doing what the other partner thinks we ought to be doing. And they've got all kinds of requirements for what they think we ought to be doing. And they're the other equal partner. They know best, right? Hillary Clinton told us 20 years ago, it takes a village to raise the children. And a lot of us didn't really think through this. If you read the book, it takes a government village to raise the children, right? And here's what happens when the government village raises your children. I'm sure you guys watch some news. I'm sure you recognize these faces, at least most of you. You have David Hogg there. The guy, he's so smart. He went on national television and he said, our parents don't know how to run an effing democracy. Give us that and we're going to take care of this. Right? On national television, he said it. Doesn't even know what form of government we have, but they're going to do a better job than all you guys. You guys don't know anything. And then you have his sidekick, Emma Riley, with the shaved head. She likes to run around with a communist Cuban patch on. They're going to run our democracy better than we are. And so what happened, the backstory here, one of their colleagues, one of their fellow students, spent 12 years in a government school. Long story short, he bought a gun, and he shot some other students, and instead of saying, what in the world did they teach this poor child? What did they fill his head with that he went and shot his fellow students? They said, I know, we just need to disarm everybody and have socialism. Then kids won't shoot each other. Well, newsflash, kids didn't used to shoot each other in the 40s and the 50s, right? And they could order like fully automatic machine guns from the Sears catalog 100 years ago, and they didn't do that. What changed? It's not the availability of guns, is it? It's what they're teaching in the schools. So we're going to go through some of that. But before we do get into what they're doing in the schools, I want to show you guys that there is an agenda here. There's an end goal. There's an objective. And where all of this is moving us toward that. And everybody, at least in the Republican and Democrat Party leadership, seems to agree. So rather than tell you about it, I'm going to let these guys speak for themselves.
We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders.
So that was on national television in 1991. Some of you might remember that. And there's a lot to unpack in that short little statement, but a new world order, a credible United Nations, that's creepy in and of itself, it's going to use its peacekeeping role. They're talking about the UN's military forces, the goobers with the blue helmets and the tanks and the attack helicopters that are famous around the world for raping children, for shooting civilians, for bombing hospitals, things like that. We're going to use these peace troops to implement the vision of the UN's founders. Well, that's interesting. What do we know about the UN's founders? Right after World War II, you had Joseph Stalin on one side of the table, one of the worst mass murderers in human history, maybe slaughtered 30 to 50 million human beings, some of them just for fun, right? Got to make your quota. And then on our side, at least America was represented, we sent this guy Alger Hiss. Some of you guys know the name. Kids in public school today have no idea, but they loved this guy, and that should have been our first red flag. They made him the chairman of the conference that created the UN Charter. They made him the first Secretary General. He took all the delegates down to the Bohemian Grove in Northern California to do very weird things. You can watch the Deep State video later if you want to see some footage of what they do. And then we threw him in prison because he was working for Joseph Stalin. So somebody ought to ask, I mean, it's too late now. George Bush went to go meet his maker, and I can't imagine that went well, but somebody should have asked him, why would we want to give up the vision of our founding fathers for this vision of the UN? That's a good question. And unfortunately, it's not just a Republican problem. Here's the leader of the Communist Party saying the same thing.
The affirmative task we have now is to actually create a new world order.
Yeah, new world order. So they all agree, right? Here's the other leader of the Communist Party, everybody's least favorite rapist.
After 1989, President Bush said, and it's a phrase that I often use myself, that we needed a new world order.
Right. And notice the way they talk, right? We're not going to ask the American people, you know, if we convince you guys, then we'll have a new world order. When we are successful, and we will be. Right? So they're very confident that they're going to be successful. And right now, if we continue going the way we are, they're going to be successful. I can almost guarantee it. They got 87% of our children, 12 years, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. It's done. It's over unless we deal with this, right? So if you really want to understand where this is all going, you know, their little new world order, they call their ideology socialism, sustainable development. They got all these little terms to describe it. But the best way to understand it is just take everything God commanded, ordained, revealed in His Word, in the Bible, flip it exactly upside down, 180 degrees, and there you have their vision, right? So what do we learn in the very beginning? God created the male and female. So what do they teach the kids? Oh, that's bigotry. Actually, today you get to choose your gender. God created marriage, right, for Adam and Eve, even before He created government. So what do they teach the kid? Oh, marriage, that's so old-fashioned. Today, you know, we're smarter, we're wiser, and now we can have a marriage with like 3 guys, 1 girl, 1 transgender, and 2 goats. That'll be a marriage, right? That'll be a new modern family. Private property. What did God say? Thou shalt not steal. Pretty simple, right? You can't steal something if there's no private property. So what do they teach the kids? Private property is bad. It's an instrument for the oppression of the people, and all this kind of baloney. right? Private property is the foundation of our freedom. And they're teaching the kids that it's wrong. Nation states, right? God created nation states. His word tells us multiple times God separated the people out into nations. So what do they tell the kid? Oh, we're just one global family. We just should all have one big happy world government, right? That's what they're teaching the kids. And I'm going to show you that this is what they're teaching the kids. So again, if you want to understand where this is all coming from, where this is all going, just take everything that's in the Bible, flip it upside down. You understand exactly where we're going. They've got several international agreements now that are moving us steadily in this direction. And the reason I bring them up, it's the foundation of the New World Order, is because they'll tell you their strategy. So you don't have to believe me. We're going to quote from their own documents. You have UN Agenda 21, you have Agenda 2030, and I know the Communist News Network likes to call Agenda 21 a conspiracy theory. So just in case we have any people who watch CNN, we'll knock that out of the water quick and then we'll get into what they say. So here's Bush again.
Climate Convention on the importance of economic instruments and free markets were included in this mammoth Agenda 21 document and the Rio Declaration.
So, Mammoth Agenda 21 document. Oh, it's a conspiracy theory. He's the one who signed it right back in 1992. And here is the Communist Party leader in the Congress right now.
The Earth Summit Environmental Leadership Act, as this is known, presents us with an opportunity to follow up on the important work of the Earth Summit to develop its blueprint, Agenda 21, for global environmental action. HCON Res 353 outlines a comprehensive national strategy for sustainable development in accordance with the principles of Agenda 21.
A comprehensive national strategy. Why is it that all these leaders all agree on all the important things? You know, then they'll go on TV and, oh, we should raise taxes by 2%. No, we should decrease taxes by 2%. But on all the important stuff, you just saw it, they all agree. We need Agenda 21. I'll show you what it is in a minute. We need a new world order. We can squabble about little things that don't matter, but the real important things, they all agree, right? And so Agenda 21, let's talk about this for a minute. This is what the authors of Agenda 21 had to say. It proposes an array of actions intended to be implemented by every person on this planet. So every tribesman in the Amazon rainforest, every pygmy in Central Africa, every rural homeschool kid in Christian Oklahoma, every single child on this planet needs to be brought into this system. No exceptions. And they'll tell you over and over again, not one person can escape. And then they say it's going to require a profound reorientation of all human society, unlike anything the world has ever experienced. Okay, they're not going to ask you about it. They just tell you it's coming, right? And how are they going to get here? How in the world? I mean, they know we're not going to go for this. Right? I'm not going to give up my family. I'm not going to give up my farm. I'm not going to give up my kids. I'm not going to give up my freedom. How in the world are they ever going to make this happen? Fortunately, they tell us. Chapter 36 is their strategy. Education is going to be critical for promoting sustainable development, they tell you. They say it's formal and non-formal education is going to be indispensable for changing people's attitudes. And boy, there's going to have to be a lot of attitude changing, right? Look at all these bitter clingers, as they call us. There's going to have to be a lot of attitude changing. And they know they're going to have to start with the kids, right? It's too late for us. They go on. They say that it's going to be critical for achieving the right values, attitudes, behavior consistent with sustainable development. It's got to include spiritual development. It has to be integrated into all disciplines. This is right from the UN agreement, signed by every government on the planet. You can read it yourself on the UN's website. And you guys remember what I said about taking what God said and then just flip it upside down? This is a book produced by the United Nations for children. I have a copy in my office. I almost brought it, but American Airlines charges way too much money to bring a suitcase. But here you can see, it's called Rescue Mission Planet Earth, and you see the Hindu gods are all sitting on the clouds, and they look perplexed and upset because the storks are delivering all these babies. And then on the next page, they teach the children that the earth groans every time it registers another birth. So what does God say? Be fruitful and go multiply, right? God says children are a blessing. And so what does the UN teach our children? Oh, Mother Earth is groaning every time you have a child. So don't have a child. That's bad for the climate. That's bad for Mother Earth, right? And a lot of us wonder, well, how come my kids don't have any kids, right? How come they're out there protesting climate change instead of giving me some grandchildren? Now you know, right? They've been teaching the kids this stuff for a long time. I went down to the UN Conference on Sustainable Development in 2012 in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, exactly 20 years after they came up with Agenda 21. And it was chaired by a Chinese communist, naturally. Who else would chair such a meeting? And here you have posters. They had conscripted a bunch of children into participating. And you see on the poster here, the earth is very sick. It's got the thermometer. Oh my goodness, how sad. But the doctor has diagnosed the problem. You have humans. Humans are the disease on this planet, and the UN is going to solve the disease, right? What does God say? People are made in his image, right? So what does the UN say? People are a disease on the planet, and we're going to get rid of it. And of course, education is their central strategy. Then if you go to Agenda 2030, this was signed by Obama in 2015. Again, every government on the planet signed on. They'll tell you right in the agreement that children, your children, are critical agents of change. They're going to use these new goals to bring about a better world. And like, well, we all want a better world, don't we? I mean, that's the mission of the John Birch Society, right? But what do they mean by a better world? Fortunately, we don't have to speculate because they tell us. If you read down in the agreement, goal number 10, for example, tells you that national socialism is not enough anymore. Now we need global socialism. They say we have to reduce inequality within and among countries. We got to share the wealth. I mean, this is the slogans that every communist dictator of the last 100 years has used to justify their oppression and their mass murder. They're always one execution away from utopia, right? Maybe more. But that's where we're headed, right? And this is them speaking. This is the text of their agreement. If you read on, they say the government needs to take control of consumption and production to be able to make us sustainable. And I guess the Cubans are real sustainable, right? They live on about $10 a month if they're lucky. But that's what they want for all of us. And then they tell you their strategy, again, goal number 4. See, so it's not me telling you that education is their chief weapon. It's them telling you. You go to goal number 4, they say all learners, every single one, by 2030 needs to have the brainwashing, not just to passively submit to this totalitarian ideology, but to actively promote sustainable development and all these other things that the UN wants. And you saw what sustainable development was. Ban Ki-moon, the head of the UN, said this was the Global Declaration of Interdependence, a direct attack on our Declaration of Independence. And then the head of the UN General Assembly, which they're now calling the Parliament of Humanity, where Rocket Man gets the same vote as the United States. Isn't that cute? He said this was the master plan for humanity. Again, nobody asked us, and yet it's being implemented. And the reason I do the PowerPoint is because I want you guys to see these videos, because honestly, you can't expect anybody to believe this stuff. Here's a UN video talking about how they're going to get this sustainable development stuff implemented.
Can we achieve sustainable development that protects our planet and builds a more inclusive, equal, and peaceful world without education? We can't. Sustainable development begins with education. Put global education first.
Sustainable development begins with education. Do you get it now? It's them saying it. It's not me, right? Put global education first. And we'll come back to this global education because it's important. But first I want to show you guys how this works. They've got a lot of practice on this, right? They've been doing it for a long time, and most of us didn't even realize it. So in the early 1990s, sodomy was still a crime across virtually the entire United States. The Supreme Court didn't strike down sodomy laws until the early 2000s. And if I had told you, and the John Birch Society warned you, fair warning, homosexual marriage in the early 1990s, you say, get the guys with the white coats, get the straitjacket, take them to the funny farm. That's crazy. Homosexual marriage, get out of here with that quackery, right? Well, they had a plan, and they knew that the path to achieving it ran right through the government school kids. So I'm going to show you a video that they produced by some homosexuals called It's Elementary, talking about gay issues at school. And this was shown in government school classrooms all across America. First grade, second grade, third grade kids all over the country were exposed to this propaganda. Check it out.
Today, the law says that if you're the same sex, 2 men and 2 women, you can't get married. It is against the law. And I thought that it might be kind of fun for us to sort of be pretend judges for a few minutes. What I'm going to give each of you is a sheet that just tells you that some people think that it's wrong for gays to get married, that it's not natural, and that it goes against what a family is. Other people think that the state should not decide these things, that it should just be up to 2 adults to decide what they want to do. What do you think the answer to these questions are? Should gays be allowed to marry? Should they not?
I don't see why they shouldn't. I don't see why they shouldn't.
Right, so and it shows all the little kids for the peer pressure purpose. Oh yeah, how bigoted that we wouldn't allow homosexuals to be married. They love each other, right? So they were preparing our kids, and what happened? They couldn't get this passed on the ballot in California, right? The land of fruits and nuts. They asked the people, what do you guys say? No, thank you, right? So even in California, they couldn't do it. But they knew they had prepared enough of our children so that when the Supreme Court was ready, the pretend judges, they could strike down our marriage laws. Barack Hussein Obama would light up our White House in rainbow colors, a symbol hijacked from God, and ta-da, right? We were upset. They had brainwashed our kids. And now here you have the Portland public school teachers marching in pride parades. And I could show you some horrifying pictures of these pride parades. But I want to show you how far we've fallen. Here's a video from Good Morning America. Drag kids. Look how brave.
And if you haven't heard the name Desmond Napolis, get ready for this trailblazing 11-year-old drag kid who RuPaul is calling the future. His bravery is inspiring so...
The future in bravery, right? Good morning, America. That's as mainstream as you can get. And this would never have been possible without the indoctrination that took place in public schools over the last few generations. Right, now I want to show you guys what they're teaching the kids today. And this is going to sound totally crazy to anybody who got an education prior to like 2005. Because we all learned that carbon dioxide is the gas of life. You know, it's this wonderful molecule. Humans exhale it. The plants use it for photosynthesis. And isn't that wonderful? It's the cycle of life. In fact, we're all carbon-based life forms. Right? You could not have life on this planet without CO2. And yet, they're teaching our kids, you hang on to your seats, that CO2 is a toxic pollution that's going to kill us all unless we let the UN tax and regulate it. We're all doomed within 12 years. That's what they're teaching the kids from CO2. Right? You exhale about 2 pounds of CO2 per day. Right? Human emissions of CO2 make up a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of 1% of all the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. I've been going to these UN conferences on climate change for a decade, and I've interviewed a lot of the scientists. Anyone who will ever talk to me, I'll put them on camera and talk to them. And what you'll find, you can go on YouTube and watch these, even a lot of their own scientists will say, this is a giant hoax. They're lying. I tried to tell them that this was not correct, and they did it anyway. Right? So it's a giant hoax. From a scientific perspective, the idea that human emissions of CO2 are causing climate change is absolutely ludicrous. But from a totalitarian point of view, it's brilliant. Right? There's nothing you can do that doesn't involve CO2 emissions. Nothing. You can't eat, you can't sleep, you can't watch TV, you can't turn on a light bulb, you can't even die without CO2 emissions. Right? You die, you decompose, CO2 comes out. It's just how it works. Right? So there's nothing you can do that would be outside the regulatory and taxation purview of the UN if they make this through. And you know, they've looked at the polling data. They know that the overwhelming majority of older Americans knows this is idiocy. So what do? They go for the kids. Here's a video by the UN, what they want in the schools.
We hope that as many schools as possible will follow examples like this, and we will support them in their efforts. Education is a powerful tool to address climate change and to ensure that the rights and needs of people today and tomorrow can be met. Let us use it and get active today.
It's a UNESCO video. Education to fix climate change, right? I'll tell you guys a story. About 1,000 years ago, there was this big community of Vikings living on Greenland. It was a lot warmer back then, side note. And so they could farm there. They were farming, they were raising critters, and it was a nice life there. And then it started getting colder and colder and colder. The climate was changing, right? And there was no SUVs to blame it on. So they said, hey, let's sacrifice a bunch of children to the gods and see if we can get this climate change to stop. Well, guess what? It didn't stop, right? And I submit to you that sacrificing children to the climate gods is probably more effective than education for stopping climate change, right? You can't stop climate change. Climate has been changing since God put this planet here, and it's going to change as long as this planet's here, right? We have cold, we have hot, we have all kinds of changes. Has nothing to do with the gas you exhale, but this is what they're teaching the kids. Here's what it looks like in an American classroom.
You've heard the reports. The globe's warming. It's our fault, and the consequences will be terrible.
Children are frightened.
I worry. My mom worries.
The water might rise and it might flood the whole town.
We won't be able to survive for long.
What are you most worried will happen?
We'll all die.
Are there some people who say this isn't true?
Yes.
Yes.
Might they be right?
No.
How do you know they're not right?
Well, because the earth is getting hotter.
Where do you learn this?
Can't you see? Oh, can't you see? What global warming is doing to me? Can't you see? Oh, can't you see? What global warming is doing to me?
One of the main components after educating the students of global warming is that they're given a letter for their families to sign, and this is the congressman or woman.
A letter for their congressman. Right? It goes on. It gets crazier and crazier. But here you have what comes out the other side, right? A bunch of little kids, tax CO2 emissions to save the planet. You know, Gaia's going to be mad at us and all the rest of it, right? So again, they know that adults who got an education prior to 2005 are never going to believe this garbage because it's ridiculous. But they know that if they can brainwash the kids, they'll make it happen eventually. And see, we still have this idea that we send our children to school to learn how to read, write, do math, that kind of stuff. Totally wrong, right? And you don't have to take my word from it. I've become friends with Charlotte Iserbyt in recent years. She was the senior advisor on education policy to Ronald Reagan. And she got to her post at the Department of Education, started looking through the files and said, oh my goodness, they're turning American schools into replicas of the Soviet schools. That's not a good idea. So she starts leaking these documents. Here's what she says is going on in the schools.
You think the purpose of education is reading, writing, and arithmetic? The purpose of education is to change the thoughts, actions, and feelings of students.
Who knew? And here's one of the ladies who was involved in doing this. Her name is Shirley McCoon. She was hired to write national standards before most of us even knew we were going to have national standards. This was during the Bush and the Clinton administration. And here she is speaking at the National Governors Association. I want you to listen to what she's saying.
Term fix and fix up these schools and taking care of them, rather than the issue of understanding that what we're into is a total restructuring of the society.
Total restructuring.
What is happening in America today and what is happening in Kansas and the Great Plains is not simply a chance situation in the usual winds of change. What it amounts to is a total transformation of our society.
A total transformation of our society. So here's how the schools are bringing this about. Same lady, Shirley McCoon, will tell you all about it.
A couple phases of it. But what I'm not sure that we have really begun to comprehend or to act on sufficiently is the incredible amount of organizational restructuring and human resource development restructuring. The whole ballgame in this particular changed society is that there's only two things that really matter. One of those is the information capital that we can put together and our ability to use information to produce products and to produce new ideas and new...
The social change function of schools. See, the average American has no idea that there's a social change function. I mean, they're starting to catch on, but they didn't tell us that. They were supposed to learn how to read, write, and do math. What is the world's going on? Well, let's take a look at what this total transformation of our society looks like. Any parents who have little children in the room, if you don't want them to hear some really intense stuff about, LGBTism and all that, now would be a good time to step out. Some of my kids have seen this presentation, so I think it's good for them to know what's going on in the world. But Chasco Middle School in Florida, a girl decided actually she was a boy. And so she told the school officials, they said, hey, why don't you go shower and change with the boys in the boy locker room before and after PE class. So she walks in there, catches the boys literally with their pants down. They all come running out of there. Teacher has a gag order, not allowed to say anything. And then the school officials say to him, you have to go in there and supervise all this. He says, but there's a naked underage girl in there. What do you mean? We throw people in prison for that, or at least we did last year. What do you mean go watch a naked girl showering and change? That's crazy. So he refused. And they said, well, hey, we're going to have to fire you. We're going to have to take away your teaching credentials so you'll never work as a teacher again. Then Liberty Counsel threatened to sue. They got some of these emails. They wanted to use this guy as an example so that no teacher ever again would ever dare resist this craziness. In Minnesota, you had a little boy who decided actually he felt like a girl. And mom, dad can have a sex change? Yeah, absolutely not, right? That's crazy. Forget about it. Well, the other equal partner in this relationship knew better than mom and dad, so the school organized a sex change operation for this child. Had him surgically castrated, put him on a bunch of weird hormones, which have killed thousands of children, and put him on opiate pain medicine. After you get your stuff sliced off, apparently it hurts. And so now there's a federal lawsuit about it, but guess what? You can't reattach the private parts, right? That's all over and done with. So this is what's happening in schools across America. This I just got today from some activists out in California. School districts in California are now, this is an actual screenshot from a school district website in California. They've got individual transition plans. So a child comes up and says, hey, I feel like a different gender. I'd like to have my genitals mutilated, please. Well, do your parents know about this? Yes, no. If no, well, okay, then we got to keep this under wraps. We got to keep it quiet. So they're going to help these children transition to a new gender without even asking the parents. They'll take them for an abortion. They'll do anything they want, right? And this is, again, from the Santa Ana School District website in California, and it's coming here too. Also in California, they passed the new health education framework this year. This is a book they recommend for 5-year-olds. It's called Who Are You? A Kid's Guide to Gender Identity. And so 5-year-olds in California are being taught that old thing of male and female, that's actually bigotry. Today we know there are infinite genders. They give the kids 15 examples to choose from. Agender, bigender, trigender, nous, toi, free spirit, take your pick. And the kids are allowed to take their pick. They say, what pronouns would you like us to use, sweetie? Do you want to be a Z or a they or a shy or, Pick your thing, right? And then the teacher's supposed to remember all this. When they get a little bit older, this is the other book they recommend for children in California under this new health education framework. It's called S.E.X, Everything You Need to Know About Sex in Your Teens and 20s. And if you're very sensitive, cover your ears. They promote fisting, and some of you probably don't even know what that is. I didn't know either, and I wish I didn't. Blood play, probably many of you don't know what that is. Sadomasochism, tie people up, engage in orgies, and on and on. This is for school children in California. This is the drag queen story hour. I'm sure some of you guys have seen these pictures. If you go to their website, they brag. They're going into first grade classrooms, second grade classrooms, kindergartens. Obviously, that's a man wearing a dress and some demon horns, just so you know where it came from, right? Straight from the pit of hell. And they're teaching the kids tolerance. And it's funny they talk about tolerance, right? This is Jessica Lahore, Colorado Middle School invited it in for a career day to teach the kids, hey, you could be drag queens when you grow up, right? Won't that be a great career choice? And these people are so tolerant. I wrote an article about this, and I questioned whether it was appropriate. I said we don't know whether they invited prostitutes and strippers. And this tolerant mob started sending me death threats and email. You should kill yourself. How dare you be so intolerant, right? You should die. That's how tolerant they are, right? Wait till they have more power. And guess what, guys? This is working. It's working very, very effectively. When I was a kid, which wasn't that long ago. In fact, he mentioned Sam Blumenfeld was speaking here in 1985. I was in my mom's tummy in 1985. So I was a kid not that long ago. I grew up all over the world, all different cultures, met kids from all different religions, all different backgrounds, and I never once, in all the tens of thousands of kids I met in my life, met a boy who thought he was a girl or a girl who thought she was a boy. And I bet for most of you, probably the same is true, right? You never met one growing up. In fact, the word transgender wasn't even in the dictionary when I was born. And now, according to the UCLA, they just put this study out, 27% of California's teenagers, 12 to 17, are gender nonconforming. So they're boys who don't accept that they're boys, girls who don't accept that they're girls, on and on. 27%. Do we have to wait till it's 50% before we say, wait a minute, guys, what are you doing to these poor kids? Or should we just wait till it's 75%? Maybe we just wait till they're all nuts, right? That's where it's going. And again, this is why I bring these videos. Check this out. California passed a law, I'm sure you guys have one similar in New York or it's coming, mandating that LGBT history be taught to all the children. So I actually got a copy of this curriculum they were using. First, they learned about the glories of Harvey Milk, the first openly homosexual elected official in America. Obviously, there's no mention there of the fact that he was a child rapist and that some of his victims went on to commit suicide. But hey, he's a hero. He was the first homosexual who was elected to office in America. Right? Obama named a Navy ship after him. True story. And then, as you go further down the curriculum, they tell the kids that Greek men used to take young underage boys under their wing and they would do horrifying things to them. Don't use your imagination. And so this mom goes to meet with the school officials. This is a public meeting. This is assistant superintendent. Says, why are you teaching my kids about pedophilia? And in a sane world, you'd be like, well, we would never do that. Where would you get such a crazy idea? Well, here's what she actually said. This is the assistant superintendent for curricula.
You're teaching pedophilia in school to ninth graders.
Teaching what?
Pedophilia. Pederasty, right here.
Pederasty, as I've discussed with you before, twice in my office when you come to view the materials, I've explained to you that this is done because we are talking about historical perspectives of how gender relations and different types of sexual orientations have existed in history. So this is something, something that's occurred in history, and so this is really important for us to include.
So a couple of things that really jump out there, right? This is something that occurred in history, so we have to teach the children, right? I can think of a lot of things that occurred in history. Jesus walked on this planet, right? Everything changed, but you can't mention that to the kids. So obviously something that occurred in history is not the defining characteristic of what we teach. And then she said it's a sexual orientation. Twice she said it. Well, let the implications of that sink in, folks. In California and 26 other states, it's against the law to discriminate based on sexual orientation. And they're teaching the kids that raping children is a sexual orientation. So, we all recognize that it would be absolutely insane to have a pedophile running a Sunday school ministry or a school, but what are these kids going to think when they grow up? Well, that's a sexual orientation. Don't discriminate. Come on. What's wrong with you? That's against the law, right? And this is now a organized pattern. Here's a screenshot. Somebody from a classroom took a picture here. They're teaching the kids, I don't know if you can see, pedophilia as sexual orientation. Also California, but it's coming here too. Now they have surveys, NBC Fake News, 20% of millennials identify as LGBTQ, whatever. Is one reason I no longer identify as a millennial. It's terribly embarrassing. And here's UNESCO, the UN's education agency, with their global sex education standards. When the kids are 5, they need to know about masturbation and sexual pleasure. I've got a 5-year-old at home, and I'll tell you what, you teach my kid about sexual pleasure and masturbation, I'm going to assume you have evil intentions, and there will be a very big problem, right? No 5-year-old needs to know about this stuff. None, period. By 9, they need to have the knowledge and skills to defend tax-funded abortion. And it gets crazier and crazier. And then they say it's an evidence-based curriculum. The evidence shows we have to teach this to children. So where's the evidence? So you go to the back. Planned Parenthood is listed 20 times. Largest murderer of unborn children in America is listed more than 20 times as their science. And then the rest comes from this guy, a child rapist named Alfred Kinsey, the sexologist, right? This guy was involved in the rape and sexual torture of thousands of children. Some of them as young as 5 months old. They would take 4-year-olds and stimulate them, and the kids would cry, and they would pass out, and they'd say, oh, that's evidence that these kids are having a good time. It's pleasurable. Check it out. We have to sexualize kids at very young ages because they can... You get where this is going, right? It's absolutely insane. It's criminal. It's child abuse. And yet this is the foundation of all this sex nonsense they're teaching to our kids. And what happens? It destroys these kids, right? It destroys their ability to have a proper family. It destroys their future marriages. It encourages them to fornicate so they go out and get pregnant and murder their babies. This is a society destroyer, right? And it is now institutionalized in every government school in this entire country. So, how did this all come about? Kinsey, interesting. The federal government was going to investigate Kinsey, the child rapist. And guess who comes in? All these big foundations. Oh, you can't do that, right? And so these foundations played a crucial role in bringing this all about. Our Congress back in the 1950s put together a committee to investigate all this. It was called the Select Committee to Investigate Tax-Exempt Foundations, and this was one of their conclusions. There was a revolution in America, past tense, right? And this was in the 1950s, that could not have occurred peacefully or with the consent of the majority unless education had prepared the way in advance. Here's the guy who was the lead investigator on this congressional committee, Norman Dodd, talking about what he heard from the president of the Ford Foundation.
I said, yes, Mr. Gator, I'd like very much to know. Whereupon he made this statement to me, namely, Mr. Dodd, we here operate on in response to similar directives, the substance of which is that we shall use our grant-making power so to alter life in the United States that it can be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union.
Yeah, there's a good idea. Right? We'll comfortably merge with the Soviet Union, the most murderous dictatorship except for the Chinese that's ever existed. And this is the lead congressional investigator for this committee. Here is a video of little children singing praises to our dear leader, and there's hundreds of videos just like this from schools all across America singing the praises of Donald Trump. Just kidding, right?
Okay, now everybody, let's sing it together on the count of 3.
All right. I like that.
1, 2, 3.
And anyways, in the interest of time, we're going to go through a lot of this stuff real quick. But Obama obviously didn't make America smart again or strong again. What he did do was push Common Core on our states, right? These national standards. Well, I want to give you guys just a sneak preview of this. This is Dr. Sandra Stotsky, the only English expert put on the Common Core Validation Committee by the Common Core people themselves. She refused to sign off on these standards. She said they're going to reduce the ability for children to develop critical thinking skills. They were written hastily by people who didn't care how crummy they were. So no, I'm not going to sign off on them. Here's the lady they hired to write the reading standards. She actually put, I don't agree with her politically on much, but we both see eye to eye on how you teach reading. There's only one way to teach reading properly. So she put all that in. They took it all out, replaced it with quackery, and she said the science shows this is not how children learn how to read. We'll come back to that. This is the only math expert they put on the committee, Dr. James Milgram. I serve on a board with him also. And he says that the Common Core math standards reflect very low expectations. They're as non-challenging as possible. There are actual errors in the math, and they're neither mathematically correct nor especially clear. So hey, let's mandate them in all 50 states. Great idea. This is what it looks like. Actually, in the interest of time, we're going to skip it, but I was going to show you guys some Common Core math problems. It's absurd. The federal government did a study. This just came out earlier this year. They funded it, and they found that Common Core had significant negative effects during the 7 years after they were adopted, and the effects get worse. The magnitude of the negative effects gets worse as time goes on. And yet we still have it in every single one of our states. They've also got national pseudoscience standards now, brought to you by the same people who brought you Common Core. You wonder how the kids can believe all this gender idiocy, the climate idiocy. In 12 years, they will never once hear the term scientific method as part of these national science standards. Right? What they will hear over and over and over again is that the gas you exhale is toxic pollution that's going to kill us all unless you let the UN run your life, and you came from slime that turned into a monkey over billions of years with no God, and then, yeah, So as long as you know those things, we'll call you a scientist. They're learning pseudo-history, right? Fake history. Dr. Pesta, who's been here to speak, I've been working with him closely. He actually helped us on this special report we did some of the articles. He's been doing surveys of his students every year as they come in. Every single year he's done this survey, a majority of his new students out of the public schools believed that America invented slavery. Pretty crazy, right? Slavery is an institution that has been ubiquitous throughout human history, throughout all time, through every culture. And two societies, our cousins over in Britain and here in America, decided, no, that's bad, right? The Bible says you shouldn't steal somebody's life, you can't have slavery. We're going to end it not just in our own countries, we're going to end it everywhere. And I mean, you could still buy and sell slaves legally in Mauritania as recently as 2007. That's a true story. But we ended slavery here. A lot of our founding fathers were very, very opposed to slavery. And we ended it all over the world. And yet the kids coming out of the public schools think America is this horrifying, evil place that actually invented slavery. They teach the kids that the Second Amendment guarantees the right of the government to have a militia. They teach the kids that Trump is a racist and all his supporters are white, old, rural racists. Here's kids bowing down to Islam on a school field trip. Here's the 5 pillars of Islam on a school board in Kansas. Can you imagine if the 10 Commandments were there, or if the Lord's Prayer was there? Oh my goodness, the ACLU would be on you like flies on poop. Right? Here they have Buddhist education. They make the kids meditate, and they do mindfulness education, they call it, Buddhist meditation techniques. Here they're doing Hindu exercises, yoga. So you can have Islam, you can have Hinduism, you can have Buddhism, you can have atheism. What you can't have is the 10 Commandments, the Bible, or Christianity. Right? They're also gathering an incredible amount of data on your kids. This robot here, the federal government created because they wanted to gather mental health data. This comes right out of a Department of Education report, a facial expression camera. So what it does is it examines the facial reactions of children when they're exposed to different stimuli and determines if an intervention is needed. So hypothetically, maybe a guy walks in wearing some demon horns and a dress to read LGBT stories to the kids, and the kid goes, what in the world is that? Why is that in my classroom? Aha, this one needs an intervention, right? He doesn't have the correct attitudes. And then they tell you what they're going to use all the data for. This is from another Department of Education report. They say that all this data that's being captured from these children is going to be used to enable algorithms to predict future behavior and interests of children. That's where this is going, folks. They know more about your kids than you do. They know about their dental health, their mental health, how mommy talks to daddy, how daddy talks to mommy, what kind of food you have in the refrigerator. Does daddy drink a beer at dinner? They know all of it, right? They know what you think. They've also got values clarification, and I was actually subjected to this as a child. I'm sure some of you guys were too. The UNESCO has a manual for teachers how to do this. They say that the purpose is to undermine children's belief in moral absolutes. Well, why would you want to do that? And so the way they do it is they say, hey guys, there's 9 of you in a life raft, and there's a doctor and a lawyer and an Indian chief, and the life raft can only hold 8 people. So who are you going to get rid of so that you can all survive? It's for the greater good. And obviously lawyer is the correct answer. I'm just kidding, right? I'm sure there's great lawyers in the audience. I'm just messing around. But now if the kids were thinking, they would say, well, wait a minute, we don't have to kill anybody, even the lawyer, right? One of us will take turns swimming alongside the boat, and hey, we'll just rotate, right? Once an hour, and nobody has to die. That'd be obvious. But what they actually think is, mom and dad said killing was wrong. The pastor said, the Bible said killing was wrong. But look, here's a situation where the only moral option is to kill somebody. So I guess my mom and dad were wrong, Bible must be wrong. Morality is clearly subjective. It clearly depends on the situation that we're in. So maybe there is a time and a place to kill babies or old people or to put people in camps. Right? That's what the kids leave there thinking. It undermines their belief in moral absolutes. It's very effective. They've been doing this for a long time. That's why the great majority of our young people today do not believe in moral absolutes, because they've been subjected to this kind of mental terrorism. And again, we still think that our kids are getting an education at school. You don't have to take my word for it. They're not, right? Here's the federal government's own data. Every 2 years, they do a national assessment of educational progress. 2/3 of 8th graders are below proficient in math. And, we're not talking about advanced calculus and trigonometry. We're talking as dumbed down as you can possibly get. And 2/3 of 8th graders can't even reach proficiency on that. By the time they get to high school, only 1/4 of seniors are proficient in math. Only 1/3 of high school seniors are proficient in reading. In reading, right? We're spending 12 years and $200,000 more in the state of New York, and these kids graduate, they can't even read their high school diploma. Something is really wrong. Federal literacy study in 1993, the most comprehensive that was ever done, found that about 50% of Americans were either illiterate or so close to it that they couldn't even hold a job. I mean, they're just completely helpless when it comes to taking care of themselves on reading. 2003, they found the same thing. Washington, D.C. is even worse. Over 2/3 of the adult population is functionally illiterate, according to the government's own data. And that doesn't apply just to Congress, it's the broader city too, right? They don't read the bills, we all know that, right? Ronald Reagan, even before I was born, set up this committee, the National Commission on Excellence in Education, back in 1983. And they found that this educational system threatens our future as a nation and as a people. Pretty serious, right? It threatens our future as a nation and as a people. Let that sink in, guys. And you know, we had a terrible system in the 80s too, but by today's standards, it was phenomenal. And even back then, it threatened our future as a nation and as a people. What do you think it does today? They said if an unfriendly foreign power had done this to us, we might have viewed it as an act of war. And we should. It was an act of war. It was an act of subversion aimed at overthrowing our system of government. And it wasn't always this way, right? John Adams, he wrote in a letter to a friend that a native of America who can't read and write is as rare as a comet or an earthquake. So you might find one somewhere if you look really hard, but you don't see them every day, right? Thomas Jefferson would brag that American farmers were the only ones who read Homer. And modern high school students are thinking, oh, I know about Homer, right? Homer Simpson, right? And if you want to know about the educational level of the founding generation, go read the Federalist Papers. I mean, these were written for average people. These were written for farmers and shopkeepers and shoemakers, right? These weren't for PhDs in ancient political theory. And the people could read it and understand it, and they were having a debate about the merits of the Constitution. Go find yourself a college graduate today who can read it, even in modern English. It just goes right over their head, right? They don't get it. We have data on early literacy. From the late 1700s, this scholar from the University of Montana found that almost 100% of people in Boston could read by the end of the 1700s, 90% in other places. This guy here in 1812 did a survey, DuPont de Nemours, said that not more than 4 in 1,000 young Americans are unable to write legibly, even neatly. And I can't write legibly, and I bet a lot of you guys can't either, so they were doing better back then. And they did it all without government schools, imagine that. In fact, they didn't have a $1.3 trillion government education system. They had none. They used simple tools like this, and kids learned how to read on the farm, right? And I taught my own kids to read. It takes about 2 months, right? There's a great resource in the back there from Dr. Sam Blumenfeld, Alphaphonics. Real simple, 2 months, your kids will be reading the King James Bible. Put them through school, 12 years, can't read their high school diploma. Well, this guy came along, Horace Mann, in the mid-1800s, and he decided to import the Prussian system of education to America. Up until that time, the government had virtually no involvement in education. But the Prussians had taken this idea from a communist, Robert Owen. I'm actually writing a series on the history of public education in America in the Epoch Times. You should go back and read that if you're interested. But this guy, Robert Owen, had this idea that the reason his communist colony failed was because they hadn't brainwashed the children from the time they were babies. So the real solution to making communism work was to brainwash children at younger and younger ages. Well, the Prussians got a hold of this idea, created a government school system, ordered parents to send their children there, and started brainwashing them and segregating them by age. Horace Mann thought that was fantastic. He rejected Christianity. He was a socialist. He wanted public education to equalize all men. And he wanted the Bible out of schools, which at that time was completely unthinkable. I mean, education without the Bible was like ludicrous. And yet, that was his goal. He also pioneered this idea called the whole word method for teaching reading. And in fairness, you know, maybe he didn't realize it was going to be a disaster. Within a few years, they got it out of the schools because the children were displaying signs of what today we would call dyslexia. The headmasters of the schools in Boston, after just a few years, said this change proposed by Mr. Mann is neither called for nor sustained by sound reading, or by sound reasoning. So no, we're not going to do that anymore. Around this time, Karl Marx was running around Europe saying we need the government to take over education. And he found a lot of success in Germany, or what would become Germany. And what happened to the Germans, right? A few generations later, they're goose-stepping around and putting people in camps and invading their neighbors, and then they were clobbered, right? Didn't end well for them, and it's not going to end well for us either. John Dewey came along about 50 years after Horace Mann and resurrected the quackery on the reading, by the way. We'll talk about that in a minute. Instead of looking to Prussia for inspiration, he looked to the Soviet Union. He thought they were doing phenomenal things. He wrote this crazy series of articles in the communist rag, The New Republic, about how great it was. He said they're instilling a collectivistic mentality in the children. Isn't that fantastic? He wanted to turn America into a socialist nation. He pointed to this novel here, Looking Backward, written in 1888, about an America with no private property. But he knew the American people would not support this craziness. He didn't want to teach kids how to read. He didn't want them to teach them how to do math. He wanted the schools to socialize them so they would become part of the collective. And he wrote in this essay that we reprinted in the back of the book there, Crimes of the Educators, change must come gradually. To force it unduly would compromise its final success by favoring a violent reaction. So he knew American parents and taxpayers and teachers would not go for this. So instead he went to the Rockefellers. Yeah, Rockefellers. They gave him millions of dollars through the General Education Board. He set up an experimental school where they cranked out a bunch of illiterates who couldn't tell right from wrong, and they said, that'll be perfect. Let's do that all across America. And they did. Right? They set up shop at the University of Chicago and Columbia University. They resurrected this quackery that had been exposed back in the 1840s under Horace Mann on how to not teach reading. Right? Basically, they teach the kids to memorize whole words instead of giving them the association between the letter, the symbol, and the sound that it produces, right? So they're teaching kids to read English, a phonetic writing system, as if it were Chinese, right? They get the kids to memorize the word cat instead of understanding that a C is a k, an A is an and a T is a t. They say, here's this series of squiggly lines, here's a picture of a cat, remember that those two things are the same, right? It's absolute quackery, it doesn't work, and yet John Dewey resurrected this, knowing full well the damage that it would do. They were exposed in the 1950s. Rudolf Flesch wrote this book, Why Johnny Can't Read, said the teaching of reading all over the United States, in all the schools, in all the textbooks, is totally wrong and flies in the face of all logic and common sense. Very mild criticism, but right on the money. And now we have brain scans. Sam Blumenfeld wrote a book in 1973, The New Illiterates. He broke down all the reading curricula that were in use in America, exposed the damage they were doing. Then this guy comes along with modern brain scanning equipment. He says, hey, you guys are doing physical damage to the brains of these children. He scanned the brains of children who had learned to read properly versus children who were exposed to the quackery and said, oh my goodness, the brains are getting wired wrong. You can't learn to read that way, at least not properly. And so that brings us to today. Under Common Core, they still have the kids memorizing whole words. It's direct from the Common Core website. The kids need to read common high-frequency words by sight. So they have to memorize all these words. And they say, oh, we sprinkle in a little phonics later, don't worry. Yeah, after they've built a reflex to look at words as if the whole word was a symbol rather than a series of symbols. So this is why most of our people can't read properly. Right? This is what it looks like. You know, here's the words we have to memorize for September. Here's the ones for October. Why do you need to memorize words? That's ludicrous, right? You just have to know the sounds that the letters make, and then you can read. Well, now UNESCO says the whole world needs to do this. They say children must be able to read with a sight vocabulary. And I want to talk about John Dewey's religion for a minute, because you can't John Dewey was the founding father of our education system. And that is universally acknowledged. Anybody in here who's got an education degree knows what I'm talking about. If you go to Wikipedia, he's the founding father of America's public education system. He was also a very religious man, not in the sense that we might understand, but he described himself as religious. He was one of the authors and signers of the first Humanist Manifesto. Now, we'll go through just a few of these. You should read the whole document. But the very first plank, religious humanists, this is a direct quote, religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. And some of you have probably read the first words in your Bible. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? So, what is John Dewey doing here? Very strategically attacking the very foundation of Scripture, the authority of Scripture. And this was deliberate, right? This wasn't an accident that was their first choice. Also, even if you're not a Bible-believing Christian, this has very important implications to you and to your freedom. Our founding fathers didn't think it was a religious statement. They said it was a self-evident truth that God created us, that God gave us our rights, and that we institute governments to protect these rights. Well, what happens if you believe John Dewey's religion, that there is no God? Well, of course, you can't have God-given rights. If you don't have a God, you can't have rights at all, right? There's absolutely no reason why you should have any rights at all. In this Humanist Manifesto, they also said, I mean, it's just like communism wrapped up in religious garb. We got to get rid of the profit motive. We have to have a radical change in methods. We have to have cooperative ownership of the means of life. And then one of John Dewey's associates, one of the guys who signed this Humanist Manifesto, C.F. Potter, he wrote in his book, Humanism, A New Religion, that education is thus a most powerful ally of humanism, and every public school is a school of humanism. What can a theistic Sunday school do, meeting for an hour once a week, teaching only a fraction of the children? What can that do to stem 5 days of humanistic teachings? And he knew, just as well as we all should, absolutely nothing, right? Absolutely nothing. So, more recently, in the Humanist magazine, this guy put it this way: the classroom is the arena of conflict between the old and the new, the rotting corpse of Christianity, together with the adjacent evils and misery, and the new faith, humanism. Right, so these people are teaching your children a religion. They pretend like we're secular, we're neutral, but they, when they talk to each other, they know they're teaching your children a religion. It's actually not a new religion, right? This idea that man and woman can be their own little gods, we get to decide things, we get to choose for ourselves what's right and wrong. We've heard this before, haven't we? Go back to Genesis 3:5. God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be open, and ye shall be as gods, right? We all get to be little gods. Where have we heard that lie before? It ended pretty badly, didn't it? Anyways, the Supreme Court actually made this the official religion of the United States. In 1962, they banned prayer. The state of New York here had developed a prayer, Protestants, Catholics, and Jews. Hey, God, we acknowledge our dependence on you. We ask your blessings. Can't do that. That's unconstitutional. First Amendment, right? 1963, they said Bible reading is also unconstitutional. And anybody ever read the First Amendment? It says Congress shall make no law. Is the state of New York Congress? Is your local school district Congress? Of course not, right? When the First Amendment was written and ratified, most of the states had established churches. Anybody who thinks that they meant to criminalize, to outlaw a prayer at school doesn't understand the first thing about American history, right? They just didn't want some group of Protestants to take over the federal government and say, now you're all going to be Methodists or Presbyterians or whatever, right? That's what they were trying to do. They weren't trying to ban prayer at school. So this guy, this justice here, in his dissent, he actually acknowledged what was happening. He said, this refusal to permit religious exercises is thus seen not as a state of neutrality, but rather the establishment of a religion of secularism, or humanism, as John Dewey would have called it. And now we are moving toward a global indoctrination system modeled off the American system, as crazy as that sounds. And they've been working on this for a long time. Back in the 40s, they got the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They said that every child has a human right to an education that furthers the activities of the UN. Well, what if you're like me? You think the UN is a terrible dictators club from the pit of hell that ought to be dismantled and fumigated? Well, you can't teach that to your kids. You're depriving them of their human rights. How dare you? They also created UNESCO, the UN's education agency. And they were very open about their intentions back then. Julian Huxley, the first Secretary General, he said the purpose was to create a world government by building it in the minds of men at school. They put out a pamphlet in 1949 that schools must combat family attitudes. You parents out there, you're corrupting your children with love of God, love of country. How dare you do that, right? Can't do that. Then in 1990, they brought all the governments of the world together in Thailand, signed the Jomtien Declaration. And in Article 5, they said all children all over the world have to learn from the same standards. And in Article 10, they said it's not the responsibility of the family or the school board or even the U.S. Supreme Court anymore to decide what those standards will be. They said it's now a common and universal human responsibility, or a UN responsibility. So Kim Jong-un, the rocket man, and Fidel Castro and Robert Mugabe, all these paragons of virtue and knowledge, get to help decide what our children should be learning. In 2000, they got even bolder. They came together in Dakar in Senegal. They adopted another education agreement. Every government on the planet signed on. They said governments must implement strategies to change the values, attitudes, and beliefs of children. That's what they say, right? Here's the Secretary General of the UN in 2015 talking about what education ought to do.
Education must do more than produce individuals who can read, write, and count. It must nurture global citizens who can rise to the challenges of the 21st century.
Must nurture global citizens. Quick show of hands. How many sent their kids to school so they become good global citizens? All right, I've talked to tens of thousands of people about this, and not one person has raised their hand. And yet the head of the UN is saying the purpose of education is to turn your kids into global citizens. In 2016, they got this global action plan for education. They said education must include the formation of the children's spirituality. This is Irina Bokova. She was a senior member of the Bulgarian Communist Party, the regime that slaughtered about 250,000 people out of a population of 7 million. So, I mean, maybe not quite as bad as China, but pretty bad. She hates me with a special passion. And until last year, she was running UNESCO, the UN's education agency. And she sent out this press release to their whole mailing list. They said, we have a collective duty to empower every child with the right values to shape the future as responsible global citizens. That's what they're saying, right? Not me. Then if you go on UNESCO's website, they got a toolkit for sustainable development education. They tell you that generally more highly educated people have higher incomes and consume more resources than poorly educated people who consume less resources. In this case, more education increases the threat to sustainability. You think they want your kids to have a good education? Here's what they want your kids to believe. This is a board game that UNESCO created. It's in government schools all over the world. And the kids have to get the right answer so they can move to the next square. Here's one of the questions. This is absolutely true. You can download this game on the UN's website. What is the best way to fight poverty? And if you have 2 brain cells, you can think, all right, what are the richest countries in the world with the least amount of poverty? America, Switzerland, Canada, Japan. What do they all have in common? Free markets, private property, at least some tenuous tie to biblical principles. What are the poorest countries in the whole world? Cuba, Haiti, North Korea, Venezuela. What do they all have in common? Share the wealth produced, right? And so this is what they're teaching our kids. Here's another video from the UN.
The Education 2030 Agenda is our roadmap to inclusive and quality education for all. UNESCO, the UN's specialized agency for education, is leading the global and regional coordination of this ambitious goal, responding to cutting-edge global challenges, supporting countries to build better education systems, and monitoring progress to make sure the world stays on course.
They're supporting countries to build better education systems, and they're monitoring progress to make sure we all stay on course. But that's only for third world countries, right? That's not for America, obviously. Wrong, right? Here's Arnie Duncan. Spent 7 years as Secretary of Education. He gave a speech to UNESCO. He said, "You guys are my global partner in reforming education." He quoted a communist terrorist. I won't tell you which one because we'd need another presentation. But he said education is the most powerful weapon you can use to change the world. He said education is a global public good unconstrained by national boundaries. He said we must advance the sustainability movement through education. Did anybody send their kids to school so you could advance the sustainability movement? No, I didn't think so, right? They said we got to build the science of sustainability into every curriculum, starting in kindergarten. And now we are at the global education system, right? And we've only got like 3 hours left. No, I'm just kidding. We're almost done. They have a world core curriculum now, right? It's a world core curriculum developed by this guy, Robert Mueller, and no relation to the special counsel as far as I know. But this guy was a real piece of work. If you're a Christian, he might offend you. He said the UN was the body of Christ. Kim Jong-un and Robert Mugabe, the body of Christ, right? So he developed this world core curriculum. He wanted it taught in every school on the planet. You can read it on the UN's website. And he was very honest about what he was doing. He put together a teacher's manual for the world core curriculum. You can go get a copy at your local library. Check out the foreword, which he wrote. And he said the underlying philosophy upon which it's based will be found in the teachings set forth in the books of Alice Bailey by the Tibetan teacher Djwhal Khul. And for most Americans, that is absolutely meaningless because we don't know who Alice Bailey is or Djwhal Khul. But they all know, right? They all know exactly who this is. I'll give you a hint. We won't go too deep down this rabbit hole because we'd all get scared, or some of us would. But Alice Bailey was the founder of the Lucifer Publishing Company. Absolutely true story. They changed the name now to the Lucius Trust because people were like, what? Lucifer Publishing Company? She was a disciple of Helena Blavatsky, and that probably means something to some of you. If you have time on your own, go check this stuff out. And then this Tibetan teacher, Djwhal Khul. Turns out he's not Tibetan, he's not a teacher, he's not even a human being, right? Alice Bailey claimed to be in communication with these spiritual masters. She called them ascended masters. And she said there were these benign spiritual beings that were going to lead us to this global age of enlightenment. Now, if you've read your Bible, you know she was talking to demons. But be that as it may, this Djwhal Khul was the chief of these ascended masters. And we ought to know, right, if the whole global education system is modeled on her teachings, we ought to know what they were writing. Well, here's one of the books she and her demons wrote. It's called Education in the New Age. And you should read this book because the whole thing is filled with abominations and monstrosities. But they say that world citizenship should be the goal of the enlightened with a world federation and a world brain. Our problem is to attain a synthesis of Marxism and neo-scholasticism, and to do this by the freely chosen cooperative methods advocated by our friend, the communist, John Dewey. So we're back full circle now, right? That's where this is all going. And they'll tell you this. This isn't me saying this. This is stuff they are saying, right? So you don't have to take my word on this. Common Core is part of a global system. In 2015, the UN put out this report. They said, hey, when we started this global education mission, we only had like 12 countries where we had national education standards lined up with the global ones. Today, we have over 100. In America, we call them Common Core. Now, Bill Gates, he put $2.3 billion of his own money into Common Core, largest financier of Common Core except us, the taxpayers. And what less people know is that in 2004, he signed an agreement with UNESCO, flew over to Europe. There he is with the head of UNESCO at the time, where they agreed they were going to create a global syllabus and a global curriculum to train teachers all over the world in how they can go instruct students. And crazy stuff here. But here's a video that the Common Core people produced that will tell you exactly what you need to know about Common Core.
Up until now, it's been pretty hard to tell how well kids are competing in school and how well they're going to do when they get out of school. Is a girl in your neighborhood being taught as much as her friend over in the next one? Is a graduating senior in, say, St. Louis as prepared to get a job as the graduate in Shanghai? Well, it turns out the answer to both of these questions is no. Because for years, states have been setting different standards for what students should know and be able to do at each grade level. What we really need are clear goals. That's where the Common Core state standards come in. The standards are consistent from school to school, and they match up against international standards too. Now we know how we're doing compared to just about everyone.
Shanghai,
so
and
even
Paris.
though local communities will still design their own curriculum, with the same rules, everybody can compete on the same kind of staircase.
And again, that's them telling you, folks. Right? It's not me telling you this is a global education system. It's them bragging about it. So that's where we are today, guys. Unfortunately, this has not stopped under the Trump administration. Betsy DeVos has fibbed to us several times, claiming Common Core was gone. It absolutely has not, and she knows that because she has to sign off on every state's standards now under the Every Student Succeeds Act. She knows that's a lie. She went down to Argentina last year and signed this G20 agreement. They said they were going to incorporate their shared values into the curricula of all education systems around the world. What shared values do we have with communist China, the most murderous government on the planet? What shared values do we have with Saudi Arabia? Chop your head off for becoming a Christian. I don't know. But they said we commit to facilitating the internationalization of education. And back to the polling data, right? Most young Americans are socialists. Young Americans are leaving their churches in droves. Nehemiah Institute did a study. 80% of Christian children from Christian homes with 2 Christian parents who are taken to church every weekend will leave their church after 12 years in a government school. Our churches aren't going to survive another generation of this. Neither is our liberty. Here's the trends, right? You see Protestant Christianity in cataclysmic decline, and you see the red line at the bottom. That's the atheist, the secularist, the humanist, rising like a rocket. And even a lot of these people who still self-identify as Christian, they're really humanists. I mean, they're not Christians in any real sense of the term. They don't believe in Christ. They don't believe the Bible. They're humanists. They call themselves that because that's what their parents taught them. But you guys remember when Obama said, whatever we once were, we're no longer a Christian nation. I hate to agree with Obama, but he may be right. Okay, so solutions. Everything that I just showed you was a documented fact. Now I'm just going to spend a couple minutes telling you guys my opinion about what we do about this, and the only opinion that matters. I'm going to give you guys a couple quotes from Scripture so you know what God thinks about this. The first question is, can we reform this system? Absolutely not. Right? It's doing exactly what it was supposed to do. The people who created it wanted it to crank out little socialists by the millions who would eventually overthrow our form of government, our churches, and implement a socialist system. It's doing exactly what they wanted it to do. If you take your new car to the mechanic and say, fix it, he's going to look at you funny and be like, what do you mean? It works perfectly. It's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. How are we going to fix it? You can't fix it, right? This is one of the guys who was involved in the conspiracy to create a government education system, one of Robert Owen's disciples. He eventually came to Christ and he repented of this evil he was involved in and he tried to blow the whistle. He wrote a book. He said the great object was to get rid of Christianity. And we were going to do this by setting up a system of state and national schools where parents would be compelled to send their children by law. And you know, today we're like, well, what else is new, right? Back then, people were like, that's crazy. That would never happen. I mean, don't be so ridiculous, right? Well, that's what they did, isn't it? Here's Thomas Massey, congressman from Kentucky. He's got a great bill to abolish the Department of Education. I got to interview him about it at the John Birch Society's 60th anniversary dinner. In the interest of time, we'll skip through it. It's a great bill, but it's not going to solve the problem, right? People think of the Department of Education as the head of the monster or UNESCO. It's not, right? The monster is kind of like a hydra. You can chop off one tentacle and 10 more will grow back. So getting rid of the Department of Education is a good goal. We should do it. HR 899, but it's not going to fix this. So as I see it today, we have 2 options, and 2 options only. Get our kids out as quickly as we can, in as large a numbers as we can, or just get ready to lose your freedom, lose your country, lose your kids, lose your church, lose your constitution, lose everything. That's where it's going, folks. There's 2 options. If someone has the third one, I'd love to hear it, but that's all the options that I see right now. There is some good news. 7 out of 10 Americans would like to take their children out of public schools. 7 out of 10. So they all have a sense that something's wrong. They don't know how urgent it is, but they have a sense that something is really, really wrong. What we need to do now is show them how urgent it is. So what we're arguing here, and I borrowed this term from my friend E. Ray Moore of Exodus Mandate, we need a Dunkirk operation. And if you went to government school, you know, I'll give you a quick background on this. Dunkirk, the British Army was surrounded on the beaches of Dunkirk by Hitler's National Socialist forces. They were about to be annihilated. And the British people said, no, please, right? They got on their knees, they prayed, God, we need a miracle. They put every resource in their society at the disposal of this rescue operation. Everything that could float went across the English Channel, picked up those boys, they took them back to Britain, and they lived to fight another day. And I can happily report that today the British people are not speaking German. They may be speaking Arabic soon, but that's a question for another talk. They do have a Muslim mayor, right? Brits are a minority in their own capital city now. It's a true story. But we need a Dunkirk operation now to rescue our kids, now, right? If they go, we're all doomed too, right? We need to understand that. If our boys and our girls are devoured by this monster, it's over, folks. That's how simple it is. So, parents, I'm really talking to you, and grandparents, you can talk to your kids about this. You've got to get your children out. You've got to get them out. Think of it as a burning building, right? The public school is on fire. You would run in there and you'd grab your kid and you'd run as fast as you could in the other direction. Why? Because you're worried about their physical well-being. And their physical well-being is important, right? We don't want our kids to get burned. We don't want them to have their wieners sliced off to become transgender. The schools are doing tremendous physical damage to our children today. They're doing brain damage. They're putting them on drugs. They're teaching them to have abortions. The kids are in physical danger like you can't imagine. But it's worse. The spiritual danger, the academic danger, right? The moral danger, all of it, right? It's much more urgent than a burning building. So yes, we need to talk about the burning building, but we got to keep our priorities straight. First, we get the kids out. Then we talk about what do we do about this burning building. I mean, we don't want the burning building to burn down our community, right? So it's an important thing that we have to talk about, but we have to have our priorities right. The first thing we need to do is get the children out immediately, right? We wouldn't form a committee and have a debate and go to the school board meeting to discuss the kids in the burning building. We would run in there, we would get them out, and we would go as far away as we could, right? That's what we need to do. Pastors, priests, rabbis, God put you as a shepherd in your congregation for a reason. You're supposed to keep the flock safe from the wolves. And yet, a lot of the people in your congregation are sending the children to the wolves. And what are you doing about it? Nothing, because you don't want to offend those 2 government school teachers in your congregation. Guess what? They already know, right? That's why they homeschool their kids. That's why they send their kids to private school in massively larger numbers than average Americans, because they know, right? They know that this is not a suitable place for children, so they don't send their kids there. Right? We need to take a lesson from them, and pastors, you need to help make this possible. Right? If you don't have a Christian school at your church, why? Get one built. If your church is too small, maybe network with 10 other churches and build one between all of you. We've got a School of Freedom Project Academy. We'll bring a school right to your church for almost no money. Right? Just basically what it costs us. Set up a scholarship fund. I talked to a pastor in Ohio. They've got a scholarship fund. So when a parent says, oh, I can't afford to get my kids out. Oh, yes, you can. We got you covered. Right? There's plenty of resources in the body of Christ to protect our children. We also need to understand, why do we have education? Who should be in charge of education? And fortunately, God gives us a lot of insight on these questions. First, I want to turn to Proverbs 22:6, where God tells us that Caesar ought to train up a child in the way that he should go, and even when he's old, and you guys are all like, well, he didn't say that, right? Of course he didn't say that. He's talking to parents. You can read the Bible every which way, sideways, upside down. You'll never find any reference to Caesar educating the children. That's because God did not delegate education to Caesar, right? Caesar's got an important job. He's supposed to wield the sword and punish evil, but he's not supposed to educate your kids. That's your job, parents. That's your job. Next, Deuteronomy 6:6-7. What is an education supposed to look like? Well, part of it is these commandments that I give you, you have to have them upon your hearts, and you have to impress them upon your children. Is the school impressing them upon your children? No, they're not. Right? You got to talk about them when you're sitting at home, when you're walking, when you're lying down, when you're waking up, all the time. That's what your education ought to be. Caesar, don't provoke, oh no, it's fathers, don't provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Again, fathers, right? Now, something about education. God tells us what an education ought to look like. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Proverbs 1:7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Interesting. You guys know just as well as I do that you can't even mention the Lord in school, right? They'd rather have head lice or even a school shooter than any mention of the Lord at a school. Can't say Jesus. Oh my goodness, we'll get the federal courts on you. We will destroy you. You think your kids are going to get any knowledge there? You think they're going to get any wisdom there? Of course they're not, right? And what happens when the kids don't have any knowledge? My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, is what Hosea 4:6 says. Martin Luther, for you Protestants out there, said that any school that's not diligently teaching the Scriptures is going to become the great gates of hell. You're going to send your kids to the gates of hell? I hope not. Pope Pius XI, he said any education that doesn't have God at the center of it is false and full of error. For you Catholics out there, you're going to send your kids to get an education that's false and full of error? Why? Harvard was once a good school, believe it or not, and they said the purpose of education, the main end of the student's life and his studies, is to know God. Okay, that's the point of education. John Milton, one of the great thinkers of our civilization, said the end of learning is to repair the ruins of our first parents by regaining to know God aright so we can love Him, imitate Him, and be like Him. There's the purpose of education, folks, the exact opposite of what the schools are doing. We live in a self-governing republic. We're very blessed. And so in America, we have another purpose to education. That is to create self-governing citizens who are capable of governing themselves. Right? We don't have a king in this country. We are the kings and queens of this country. And so God has given us instructions. How are we supposed to govern? Well, the government is supposed to punish evil. So if someone's murdering babies, well, quick, get them, right? Put them in jail where they belong, right? Is that happening today? No, because our kids don't know how to govern themselves. So how do we do this then? What do we do? That's not my family. That's just a picture of my family. We do homeschooling. That's what we do at my house. And I would not trade it for the world. And people say, oh, how do you afford that? You know what? I'd live in a cardboard box before I would give up homeschooling. It's a true story. It's, as far as I'm concerned, the best option. And we're in good company. Right? These men here were all primarily homeschooled. Not one of them ever stepped foot in a government school. Not one. Some of them got a little bit of private study from tutors and private academies, and some went on to get a college degree, but they got the bulk of their education at home. And guess what? They built the greatest, freest, most prosperous nation the world's ever known without any government education. So we can all do it, folks. The data on homeschooling is like the brightest spot on the educational horizon. We've got millions of kids being homeschooled. They are running circles around the victims of the government schools, 80th to 90th percentile on the government's own standardized tests. Right? This is true even if the parents don't even have a high school diploma. I tell people only half jokingly, like, hey, you could put your kids in a closet for 12 years and they'd be better off. And I'm only half joking, right? Because at least their heads wouldn't be filled with nonsense. At least they wouldn't be telling them they can choose their gender and they can kill their babies, right? So homeschoolers do better as adults. They do less drugs. Their marriages last longer. They get better jobs if that's your thing, right? You want to earn a lot of money. Homeschoolers do better on every metric, and they're better socialized on every metric we can measure. There's a lot of great private schools. I know not everybody's called to homeschool. There's a booth outside, the Augustine Classical Academy. Talk to them. There's other private schools here. Talk to them. Folks, do your due diligence, right? Catholics out there, half of the Catholic dioceses in America are using Common Core. You don't want to go there, right? A lot of the Protestant schools are just replicas of the government schools, but there's a lot of great ones. So you have to do your due diligence. You wouldn't just trust a random stranger to educate your kids. Why would you just trust a random private school? Make sure you do your due diligence. I work for the Freedom Project Academy. I teach economics there. If you want literature and flyers, there's some in the back. Great education for the kids, a fraction of the cost that government schools charge taxpayers. It's like $2,500 a year. We can set it up in your church. And we need to recognize, too, that the UN and the government is not going to tolerate all this educational freedom indefinitely. They've told us that, right? The UN in 2015, their Human Rights Council, where Cuba, Venezuela, China get to talk about how horrible America's human rights record is, they said that every child has a right to a government education. We can't have all these private schools teaching whatever they want. We need global standards, and every child needs to have the right to learn from these. Right? This is what the UN is saying. State of New York. True story. This just came out last year. New York outlines new guidelines for what private schools must teach. They're coming for the Jews first, where have we heard that? But they're coming for us next, okay? And again, they're brainwashing our kids. They're dumbing down our kids. If you want the whole story on the dumbing down, get a copy of that book. Ed's got some in the back. And here we are with our guns. They'll take this from my cold, dead finger. They'll never enslave me. Guys, I'm a Second Amendment guy too, and they'll take my guns from my cold, dead hands too, but that is not going to work, guys. It's not going to work. They don't need your guns. They have your kids, right? What are you going to do with your guns when it's your kids coming to take them? Absolutely nothing, right? So Hitler put it this way: when an opponent declares, I will not come over to your side, I calmly say, your child belongs to us already. You will pass on, but your descendants now stand firmly in the new camp. In a short time, they will know nothing else but this new community. And that's where we are now, folks. Go talk to a high school student. Ask them about the Constitution. Ask them about the Declaration of Independence. Ask them about God-given rights. Oh, don't bring that religious mumbo-jumbo. They don't even know that that's the basis of our country. Ask them about Noah. Ask them about Abraham. Ask them about Jesus. They don't know anything about anything that matters. They can tell you gender theory all day long, the climate change, all that stuff. They don't know anything about what matters. So we need an exodus of monumental proportions from the schools. We can look to our founding fathers for guidance and wisdom. They put their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor on the line. The odds looked overwhelming, right? Going up against the most powerful empire that had ever existed. Hey, we're farmers, we're going to get them, right? They must have looked so ludicrous. Well, guess what? The odds aren't good for us either, but if we stand for what's right, if we do what's right, we can win this. But we won't win it without our children. So, fortunately today we don't have to put our lives on the line, right? Not yet at least, that may come. If you're not involved in the John Birch Society yet, why not? Right? These are the people who've been holding the line for 60 years. We couldn't have this meeting today if it wasn't for the efforts of the John Birch Society. Get involved, folks. It's named after this missionary. These are the people who've been holding the line for freedom. And without them, I'm convinced that we would already be living under slavery. So you got to get involved. Get involved in a local chapter. Help us hold the line while we protect our kids. I've got a lot more speaking events to go, a lot of them in New Jersey, Connecticut, Nevada, Idaho, all over the place. If you have any friends in any of those places, go to libertysentinel.org/tour. You'll see all the dates, the contact people, send them out. I'm only going to ask you guys one thing before you go. Make sure you get a copy of this. What are they, $1? $1. Make sure you get a copy of this before you go. If you agree already, get 10 copies. Give them to your pastor, give them to your congressman, give them to your state legislator, give them to your neighbor, give them to your kid so they can pull your grandkids out of the system. It's basically a more comprehensive version of what I just gave you today. We've got a DVD. We know that we have a lot of illiterate friends, and that's not their fault. It's the system. But hey, so we've got this on DVD. Ed is actually making a DVD of this talk. So what I just said today will be on a DVD. You can pre-order those with Ed, and he'll get them to you when they're out. Please, guys, we want to get 1 million copies of these out. We want to rescue millions of kids. So once you're convinced that this is important, go to thenewamerican.com/rescuing our children. Order 100 copies, order 1,000 copies, get them out to everybody. You can call this number if you don't do the internet thing. Get some copies and distribute them. That's the only way we're going to get this information out. And finally, I want to close with a scripture, because I don't want anybody to leave thinking that this is just a political problem or even an educational problem, right? It's much bigger than that. And our enemies understand this. Alice Bailey understood perfectly what was going on here. Right? It's a spiritual battle. So God tells us in Ephesians 6:12 that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, and against spiritual wickedness in high places. That's what we're dealing with, folks. Anybody who would tell a child to mutilate his genitals so he could impersonate the opposite sex, that's not a legitimate difference of opinion. That comes straight from the pit of hell, guys. And we have to protect our kids. You don't send a child soldier into a war. Don't send your children into a spiritual war before you've prepared them at home or in a good Christian school with a good Christian education. That's all I have, guys. Thank you so much. God bless you all, and God bless America.